Jack gave us a great update on what's happening in Ukraine, the concerns there. We have an expert to talk about that, and that is a graduate of West Point, class of 75, a former Army football player, 43 years service in the U.S. Army, and the former superintendent of the United States Military Academy, and that is Lieutenant General retired Robert Caslen. General, how are you today?
Hey, Ken, it's great to be with you. Thanks a lot. How are you doing?
Real good, real good. Jack was the first half of the show was giving an update. We've been following the situation in Ukraine, and the Russians appear to be, all the reports are assembling over 100,000 troops. There are miles of tanks and trucks. Naval forces appear to be preparing for a blockade of Ukrainian ports. And what was even more concerning was just medical tents being set up, that they were anticipating casualties. What's your thought on what's happening? We see a briefing going on right now in the studio from the State Department.
Well, thanks. It certainly indicates, and it certainly looks like they're putting all the conditions in place so that they can go across and take over Ukraine and make that another nation under the former Soviet umbrella, which I think is what Putin really wants to do. That's his legacy, to reestablish that. He certainly has got the capacities. He's given himself a number of military options. But from his perspective, it's important to understand, I think it's important to understand his perspective, because what he has seen over the years with NATO expansion is NATO incursion into Romania and then into Poland, and then as it moves towards the east, you see this incursion going right up against Russia's western boundary. The last time Russia saw something like that, if you want to look at a map, is when Nazi Germany did that in the late 1930s. And the maps are almost identical on how German expansion and incursion into Russia's sphere of influence, and now he's looking and seeing NATO. This is his sphere. This is his sphere of influence. This is what he wants to reestablish in some degree of the Soviet Union, and this is how he's going about doing it. Can he be deterred? I think he can be deterred. Indications are he's not going to be deterred. The worst thing that we did was that we did nothing when he did this in Crimea a number of years ago. We just stood by and watched. Yeah. He put a group in there and said, hey, listen, we need some help from Mother Russia. Can you come and help us? And Russia responded. That's a false flag scenario. And I imagine there's going to be a lot of that sort of activity going on when he looks into Ukraine. So all indications are he's going to move forward. We'll see if he actually does. What I found really interesting was, I'm not sure you heard about that, was the letter from one of his principal general officers, who pretty much went public in criticizing Putin for what he's doing and whipping up an artificial scenario that was not true, and even called it to some degree a criminal activity on his part. So I'm not sure if that general officer is still in command or not, or what his situation is, but it was just interesting to see that type of debate and questioning coming from his general officer staff.
Thank you. One of the things that we've seen is, or questions, is whether Ukraine should make a statement that they would not make an attempt to join NATO and give up that level of their own sovereignty. Do you think that's something that should be considered, or is Ukraine a free country that should be able to make up its own mind?
Well, that's certainly what Putin wants. Quite frankly, if you look at the NATO expansion towards the east, I don't really see a scenario where NATO would actually, or where Ukraine would actually be accepted into NATO. And I'm not sure whether the United States would support something like that, or even some of the other Western European countries. Strictly because of what it's one of those red lines with Russia, and everybody knows that. So for Ukraine to come and make a statement saying we are not going to be part of NATO, I think that would be consistent with what the current policy or future policy would look like. And frankly, I think that if they did something like that, that would be welcome to try to diffuse the current situation in some degree.
Yeah, so one of the analysts, many analysts have suggested that the conflict could start by cyber attacks. And when we've been up at West Point, we've had a chance to sit in on some of the cyber defense drills that they do. There's an annual contest with the NSA that we were able to sit in on a couple of times. How is that going in this sense? The Russians seem to be experts in cyber, and is the U.S. able in any way to help the Ukraine prevent cyber attacks that could disrupt their communications?
Well, the United States had trouble defending its own cyber networks against Russian attacks.
Yeah.
So whether they can do it for Ukraine is another question altogether. Well, Russia's already been doing the cyber for a number of years. I mean, they'll take, for example, they will go and identify by name Ukrainian soldiers who are on the front. Then they will go in there in cyber and contact through emails and stuff like that. They would contact their family, and they would say what they would do to the family. And then they would come back to the soldier and send the soldier an email message or some type of message saying, this is what we're going to do to your family. And this is the level and degree of cyber abilities that they have to identify soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers by name, to identify family members by name and cyber addresses, and then to be able to do that sort of kind of informational warfare. They have that capacity to do that. What's going to be key for cyber, if they're actually going to do an attack, is to be able to remove or eliminate cyber from command and control mechanisms for Ukraine or any other element that's helping Ukraine fight against the Russians. If they totally take out that communication capacity, the cyber capacity, then you got to go back to an old vintage type of communications. And if they are not adept at that, or if they haven't practiced that, that's going to hurt them in a big way.
Absolutely. And one of the comments that I've heard you say and other Army leaders is the importance of the U.S. Army in the crucible of ground combat, that the Army is called on situations like this, which maybe was a bit unexpected after the pullouts of Iraq and Afghanistan. But when you see the Army, what do you, and the U.S. is sending about 8,500 troops into the region. What do you see about the mission of the Army in trying to prevent further advances by Russia in this area?
Well, the United States is committed as a NATO member to the NATO alliance, so that if one nation in NATO is attacked, then all nations are attacked. So the United States has put forces up in Poland and in Romania, which is like your furthermost eastern NATO nations. They also border Ukraine. But you're not going to, at least as I understand the current scenario, is you're not going to see U.S. ground combat forces in Ukraine engaging face-to-face against Russian soldiers. We do not have, since Ukraine is not part of NATO, we do not have the same alliance with Ukraine as we do with the other NATO nations. So the United States presence is going to reinforce our commitment to NATO and to all the other NATO participating nations and their commitment to reinforce Poland, Romania, and other NATO nations that are along that line right there. That's where the ground defense will occur. That's where your crucible of ground combat with U.S. participation will occur. The crucible of ground combat certainly will occur if Russia invades Ukraine between Ukraine ground forces and Russian ground forces.
Certainly. And we're talking with Lieutenant General Robert Caslen, former superintendent of the United States Military Academy. Also, since his retirement, has served in education at the University of Central Florida and also at the University of South Carolina. And just a quick thought, General, on concerns. There's been so much activity in the Pacific. Jack was just talking about another North Korean missile launch and concerns about China trying to make an effort to go into Taiwan. Is there something that really stands out for you in that area?
The thing I'm more concerned about between China, Taiwan, North Korea, Russia, Ukraine is the one that everybody has forgotten about, and that's Iran. Iran in its pursuit of nuclear weapons. And if Iran acquires a nuclear weapon, they have committed themselves publicly to destroy Israel. Israel has committed themselves to attack and destroy Iranian nuclear weapons. And unless we resolve that sort of thing, Iran is on full glide path to acquire a nuclear weapon soon. And what we're doing about that, other than some of the current negotiations and discussions, and what will result out of that, I'm not sure. But I think that's more of a tinderbox than even what Taiwan and China is. Taiwan's going to watch what Russia does with Ukraine in U.S. and NATO response, because they will see U.S. response to Ukraine similar to what they can expect U.S. response to Taiwan.
Okay.
But China has been firm all along, saying Taiwan is a stepsister that is just out of line, and they're one of our provinces, and they're still part of our nation. That's what they feel. That's what their policy is. And to them, it's just a matter of time between they can bring this stepchild, misbehaving stepchild back in.
Hey, Lieutenant General Robert Caslen, thank you so much for calling in. You are the author of The Character Edge, a great read. And thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for your service to our country.
Thanks, Ken.